Okay, so we're going to keep going, and I want to say a little bit more about conversion in the light of the RCIA. Here's another way of in which conversion's been understood in the light of the RCIA, and that's from conversion as a ritual process, and it's from scholars of ritual. So those two very attractive gentlemen with a magnificent mustache, that first guy, huh? That guy's name is Arnold van Gennep, and then this is Victor Turner. So who's ever heard of the word liminality or liminal, a liminal period or something like that? That's from these guys, okay? So what they basically say, they studied particularly tribal groups and the processes of initiation that would happen in those tribes, okay? So the idea was that through processes of initiation or rites of passage, a boy would become a man or a couple would get married. These sorts of processes, the people who were thinking about conversion thought there's something that's going on in that. So Arnold van Gennep, the guy with the mo, he says that there are three kind of stages in these processes. So the first is that there are some rites that separate people who are about to go through a process of change, okay? So rites that separate, that distinguish them, so they're taken outside of their normal environment. So in the case of a boy, perhaps, he's no longer able to live in the family home for a little while because he's no longer a boy, but he's not yet a man. So he's removed from the family home in these sorts of rituals. The liminal period is a period of that kind of, I'm no longer this, but I'm not yet that, a betwixt and a between. So the idea here is that in this period, it might be that so for example, in Native American tribes, this is the kind of process where somebody might be taken out into the desert and they're left to fend for themselves for 24 hours or a week or something like that. They've been removed from their normal environment and now they're going through a ritual kind of process that when they come out the other side, they're reincorporated into the group, but now they have a new identity, that they're now, instead of a boy, they're now a man. Instead of being two single people, they're now married. And so these two guys, so Van Gennep identified these three areas. What Victor Turner does is he says, these actually affected or create a new identity. The boy becomes a man, yeah? Okay. The unmarried becomes married, and so on. So this is a way of understanding. So when people have looked at conversion in the RCIA, the process by which somebody goes from being unbaptized through to becoming a Catholic Christian, they say, well, maybe it looks a bit like this kind of ritual process of these three stages. There's a few problems with that, though. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what that... There's a big problem with that as a process. Has anyone got any ideas about what it might be? If you're applying these three processes to the RCIA, I suppose the clue would be, think about the context in which they studied this. It was in the context of tribal groups, right? Now think about it in relation to the RCIA. Where might the comparison fall down? I think it's this. It's that when somebody, if you're a 12-year-old boy and you're about to become a man, that actually kind of happens as a matter of course. Might not necessarily happen strictly chronologically, but when you get to a certain stage, perhaps the beginning of puberty, something like that, you then undergo this process. What that won't tell you then is how is it that somebody even gets to the stage where they want to become a Christian? Okay, so this might explain the process of going through the catechumenate, of wanting to be changed, of wanting to grow in faith, of wanting to become a Christian, but it doesn't explain how you get to that point in the first place. So in the language of the RCIA, it doesn't explain that first phase of evangelization. It only explains from the second phase in the catechumenate, which would already be a liminal kind of period. You're no longer not a Christian, but you're not quite yet a full Christian, okay? So that's the issue with it. Having said that, there are some things that are helpful about this, because it does explain something of the power of ritual in the RCIA to bring about change. So the RCIA has a number of different rites associated with it. In the first period, the evangelisation period, there's no rites. But the moment you become a catechumen, the rite of entrance into the catechumenate, there's a ritual action that happens there. One of the most powerful symbols of that is that you start that ritual outside the church and then you come in to hear the gospel, okay? You come in to hear the gospel. It's a ritual action that celebrates something that's already happened, because a person has to have heard the gospel to really get to this point where they want this, okay? But it actually can also help to kind of affect a change. Similarly, there's another ritual moment at the very beginning of Lent, which is the entrance into the final stage of preparation before baptism at Easter. And this moment is also a powerful ritual. It's the rite of enrolment. People go into the cathedral for a liturgy, okay? And sometimes those liturgies are more moving than others. But I think the key thing about it though is that you're very publicly saying, you're going into the city and you're publicly saying before others, I'm going to be, like, in a sense, not just in front of the community of faith that I've been connected with in a parish for a while, but now to a whole lot of people, a cathedral full of people, my intent is to become a Christian. There's something powerful about that. The journey to go and do that, you're doing that with a group of people and you come back, it can bring about a change. In the catechumenate, there are also other rituals as well, okay, that being prayed with. There are blessings that are prayed over the people. There are what are called minor exorcisms, which are prayers that people would be delivered from anything that would try and get in the way of their commitment to faith, okay? So there are prayers like that too, okay? I don't have time to go into all that in detail, but it's simply to recognise that it's not that the power of ritual, I suppose, to bring about and affect a change, okay? So this doesn't explain the catechumenate particularly accurately. I think it doesn't tell us everything we need to know about it, but there's something there that can be helpful. I wanted to pick up another model of conversion that comes from a scholar called Louis Rambo. I was so tempted to put a picture of Stallone up there for you, but I nobly resisted. That's just the kind of serious scholar that I am. I found this really helpful. Okay, so Rambo is a Churches of Christ minister, and what he tried to do was he tried to create a model that synthesised a huge body of literature on conversion that approaches it from a number of different perspectives, from a psychological, a sociological, a missiological, from the study of mission. He tried to bring them all together, okay, to create this model. And he says, look, it's a rough model. It's supposed to be like a working model, one that you use as a bit of a the word is heuristic. It's sort of like it's a way of saying, okay, here's something of what's going on. I think it's really helpful. It's been influential, and I think you can map the RCIA onto it, okay? As you're listening, you might again think about perhaps something of your experience or the experience of people that you minister or work with. So what are those stages? So the first one is context, which really runs through all 7 stages. And I want to stress here that Rambo says really clearly, this is not a linear journey, okay? I think there are some sequential points, but it's not a linear journey. So the first of those is context, which actually runs through all of them because we never escape our context. So Rambo says that one of the things that is significant in conversion is both the macro and the micro context. So the macro context is what's happening socio-culturally in our cultural world that can either predispose or get in the way of somebody coming to a conversion to Christ, okay? We talked about that in the very first lecture in this series. We talked about that socio-cultural picture when I was talking about Charles Taylor and his understanding of the age of authenticity in which we live. So that's the macro context. That's the big picture, okay? And that can affect us. And one of the things that I was saying in that first lecture is that we live in a post-Christendom world now, where the culture does not encourage people towards Christian faith. Okay, it's at best kind of neutral and sometimes not so neutral. Okay, but it's not encouraging. It doesn't. And the simple example of that is just that once upon a time, not so long ago, nothing happened on a Sunday morning. Nobody worked. No kids played sport. No shops were open. And that was all so that people could end up at church, right? Obviously that world's gone. So that's the macro context, and it matters, it's important. There's also a micro context, which is actually my more immediate kind of world, the key relationships in my life, where I live and where I work, okay? And that world may actually be incredibly supportive of faith, deeply committed Christian family, a really intentional Christian school perhaps, maybe working in I have a friend who's a GP, she works in a practice where all the doctors are Christian. Maybe her micro context might be quite supportive of faith, okay? So the micro and macro don't necessarily always line up, okay? Equally though, a micro context could be some, complete hostility, like a young person who's growing up in a family where, dad's a pretty staunch kind of atheist, okay? That has implications for her, for that man's daughter to for conversion to Christ, doesn't it? Doesn't mean it's impossible by any means, but it affects it. So that's what context is saying. Context is that those two conditions matter, and of course they run through all of these other stages. The second stage Rambo talks about is crisis. Now, part of that is that some of the early studies of conversion picked the people that were studied were people often that were grappling with deep psychological kind of wounds, and so some of the earliest literature on conversion actually portrayed it psychologically as a pathology. Okay, interesting from our perspective, isn't it? Like I imagine all of you in the room are kind of going, "Really? How does that work?" Yeah. But that was what happened, and so there was an idea here that you had to be feeling deeply unhappy or deeply dissatisfied with your life in order to convert, okay? Now that's, the problem with that is that we have lots of evidence of other people who weren't necessarily, they're not necessarily going through deep pathological or neurotic kind of instances or episodes who want to change, okay? What I think we do need to pay attention to, and Rambo makes this point, is that you've got to have some level of dissatisfaction, though, to want to undergo a change, and conversion's a change. So it doesn't mean that you have to, that doesn't mean that someone has to be mentally unstable, it doesn't mean they have to be going through deep trauma, or it doesn't have to mean any of those things, but there's got to be some kind of crisis, even in the sense of just a kind of cognitive dissonance, where you go, you know what, it could look like this. I've actually got everything in my life that you could possibly want, or that maybe our culture tells us that we should have, good marriage, lovely kids, enough money in the bank that we're not really super under pressure financially, and yet I'm thinking there's got to be something more to life than this, okay? So to call that a crisis is kind of strong, isn't it? But there's enough dissatisfaction there, enough kind of like, I'm not really at ease in my life, I want something more. So when you hear the word crisis or see the word crisis there, all I want you to think about it is a sense of, I'm not actually completely at ease with the status quo and I want something to be different. Does that make sense? Okay. The third stage then is quest. And this is where somebody's actually really searching for something. So I'm dissatisfied, I'm in that crisis kind of thing, I'm looking for something more. Now I'm really searching, and so I'm experimenting with things. I'm reading different things, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm YouTubing stuff. When somebody talks about a particular kind of practice of mindfulness or something that they found helpful, I'm willing to check it out and have a go. These are people who are really looking for something more, they're searching, they're actually saying, I want to experiment with other possibilities, okay? And then the fourth stage is encounter. And this is, we often use that word now theologically in terms of relation to Christ, but in Rambo's framework, it means an encounter with somebody from a faith community, okay? Someone from a faith community. And so what he's saying here is that that person, that search has led them to the point where they've now met somebody who's saying, hey, come and check out what it means to be a believer in my tradition, okay? Now, here's where I think those four, or those 2, 3 and 4 in particular, I think they belong in the RCIA. They belong to the pre-catechumenate or to the period of evangelisation, that first stage, okay? One of the things that I think is really important is, and this is where I think it's not necessarily linear with those 3, is that sometimes I think you can be going along in life and be going along reasonably well, you're not having a crisis and you're not really searching, but then you meet someone. And in theological language, this is the category of witness. You meet somebody who really is a credible witness to Christian faith, somebody who has a joy about them that they point to and say, you know what, I've encountered the living God. I know God loves me. I know that Jesus is there. I'm trying to live my life around that, and I'm trying to make choices around the person that I've met in Christ. And that encounter with a person like that can actually lead to a crisis where somebody else kind of says, you know what, they look a lot happier than me, or there's a joy that I can't explain about them, or they care and love people in a way that I wish I could because I know I don't. Those sorts of questions and challenges, right? And that can lead them then on a search. So again, it's not, different people are going to be different, but I want to suggest that 2, 3 and 4 interact and interplay with each other, but quite often it can be 4 first, I think, that leads to 2 and 3. But sometimes it can be 2, 3 and 4. Somebody actually, they experience family breakdown, or they experience, they spent their life, or spent a significant number of years working towards a goal. They achieved the goal, doesn't bring the satisfaction that they hoped for. There's a sense of a bit of a crisis, and I'm going to search for something that actually is going to satisfy and bring the meaning and fulfillment that I was hoping for. So 2, 3 and 4 swirl around together. Remember, number 1 permeates all of these. After that initial encounter, 5 is the category, is the step of, if you like, of interaction. Rambo says that there are a couple of aspects to this, or a few aspects to this. He says interaction, what that primarily consists of is that if I'm a would-be convert, I've now met not just one person, but I've started to meet the community that they're part of, okay? Not necessarily 1,000 people, but a little network of people. And what's starting to happen in that context is I'm starting to learn, here's they all start with R for ease of memory. I'm starting to be involved in the rituals of the community. So it might be that I turn up for worship, I turn up for Eucharist or something like that. I'm starting to learn the rhetoric, so the language. I'm starting to learn what they're talking about, what they say is important as a community, what matters to them. I'm also receiving a role, and so the role might be that they've actually given me some jobs to do, that I feel like I've got a part to play in this community, but also that I've been identified as somebody who's on that journey of faith. Okay, so in the language of the RCIA, this is your catechumen. Okay, they've got the role of being catechumen. So ritual roles, ritual rhetoric roles, and the last one is relationships, okay? That I'm building a genuine network of relationships as well, okay? So I see that sits very well with what the catechumen it's supposed to be about, okay? Sits very well with what the catechumen it's supposed to be about. After a period of time, that will lead to some kind of sense of commitment. And that commitment, Rambo uses the language of surrender, that it's actually a surrender of my life. He talks about there being some kind of aspect of this which is kind of decisive, and there might be a symbolic action that says what was in the past is no longer, and I'm embracing something new. And he's not just, while he was a Churches of Christ minister, he's saying that actually this works for lots of faith groups, not necessarily Christians, but he's clearly got baptism in mind here as well. Okay, the baptism involves a no. I'm letting go of things in my past, and I'm saying yes to things in the future. I want to stress here, and this is where I think the language is really important. In the Christian tradition, in the scriptures and theologically, that language of moving from darkness to light, from death to life, a new birth, all of that language is quite dramatic and stark, isn't it? And I think there's something in that. I think there's something, it's deep in our tradition. There's something rich there about the decisive kind of quality of saying, I'm going to be a follower of Jesus and I want to orient my life around the person of Christ. What I also want to say is that there's a lot of continuity too. So while I die, in the language of baptism, I die with Jesus to sin and death in baptism, and I'm born to new life with him. We know that the journey of struggle in that continues. Or if I feel like I want to leave behind certain destructive patterns or behaviour in my life, people do that as they're baptised. People do that through the process of conversion, but there's a continuity too, right? There's a vulnerability. There's an impact or an effect of that we carry with us. So sometimes what people, if you have hit that language of the 180-degree turn, the really stark death to life, dark to light, really strongly, if you hit that so strongly that you think, I've really left everything behind, it can be a terrible shock a little bit down the track after that, where you go, oh, you know what? Some of that stuff's still with me. Yeah? You find yourself reacting and behaving in a way that you thought you'd left behind, or you fall back into something that you thought you'd let go of. What I want to suggest there is that there's just something to be held in tension. I think there's something really powerful about the gift of baptism that says, I can leave my old life behind, that I can walk a new direction with Jesus, that I can live a new life with him. But if I think that actually has just magically eradicated every aspect of my personality, then I'm misunderstanding what the nature of the conversion looks like, that I'm still me, and I still carry something of that with me, and so those things are going to come up, especially in certain moments or circumstances and situations. The invitation there is to the ongoing conversion, that there's an ongoing change. Another language for that might be sanctification, that the process of being holy continues, and it's actually a lifelong kind of process. So that's the commitment kind of stage, and Rambo would stress that that's really important. Just note there that decisive kind of commitment, we might talk about that. This is somebody who really clearly shows characteristics of being a disciple or a follower of Jesus, and this goes to Darren's comments earlier. That's well down the process, right? It's not like, I think sometimes what happens is that an initial experience of Christ and that full-blown commitment in stage 6 that we're talking about get pushed together in our minds, whereas in reality it doesn't work like that. Okay, there's a process from the experience of an initial encounter to a moment where I say, you know what, I'm shaping and orienting my life around the person of Christ. I don't think those two things often coincide. I think if in most people's experience there's a lag or a time gap between those two things. And that period, in terms of the RCIA, that period is called the catechumenate. Okay? It's basically called the catechumenate. That's what the catechumenate's for. It's to get you from an initial experience of God through to a place where you can say, I'm living my life, with Christ at the centre, and I'm trying to make decisions in life in the light of Jesus. For those of us who have been baptised in infancy, we don't have such clear markers, but I think that that's still the case. Be really interested to see what you think about that, and I'll be looking forward to your comments in a moment. Rambo's last stage of consequences is just simply really about the implications. And this is the whole idea of, that it does affect our lives. For conversion to be really genuine conversion, things will look different. Our priorities change. What we spend our money on changes. Who we spend time with changes. These are the implications of this kind of change. One of the other things that Rambo says about all this is that it's actually really hard. It's actually really, which is kind of helpful. Sometimes the rhetoric around some of this stuff is that this magically all happens really easily. It's actually hard. People don't like changing, or as someone once said to me, people love change as long as it doesn't happen to them. So change is hard, and it's challenging, and it's scary, and these are not insignificant kind of changes. So we're not talking about little things or light things here. Okay, can we just tease out a few implications for ministry? So one of the first implications is one that I mentioned earlier in the light of Darren's comments, which I think that Gelpie's 5 dimensions of conversion, or 5 different kinds of conversion, can be really helpful for us to for a little bit of self-diagnosis and say, you know what, there might be a room for me to grow here. But particularly as we minister and accompany people, whether they're young or old, that we can have an ear out for what's going on here. When somebody says, I really love being a Catholic because I love the fact that I go and I serve the poor in the soup van every week, we can hear there, okay, well, there's tones there of socio-political conversion. What else might be there that we want to encourage? What else will we want to see foster and happen in their relationship with God? Or it might be if we hear someone say, the church is right in every situation and circumstance, and I really If I'm not kneeling and praying these prayers at a certain time every day, I'm not doing it properly, and I probably should go to confession and check about it. We might be able to say and affirm there, well, there's a really beautiful faith that's emerging in that person's life, but there might be an effective conversion to loosen up some of the rigidity around that, or an intellectual conversion to say, you know what, let's challenge and critically examine some of those presuppositions that could also be helpful. Does that make sense? I also want to, like both in the comments before and in the break, most of the questions that I was engaging with were around the whole idea of these non-religious or so-called natural conversions of Gelpies. What I want to suggest here is that these things are important things for us in ministry. Partly because Gelpie will say that when we do these things, the potential for a religious conversion increases, okay? One of the questions I was talking about with somebody in the break was, you know, for Gelpie, how important is Jesus really if these conversions can happen outside the context of faith? And I guess I can't answer that question exactly for Gelpie because I'm not quite sure, and he's gone to be with the Lord. But I know for myself, like the difference that Christ makes is I think that some of these things can easily get stuck. And I think that a relationship and a conversion to Christ actually helps unlock these different dimensions. That's easier. So there's a beautiful line in the documents of Vatican II and Gaudium et Spes, which says that Jesus doesn't simply reveal to us who God is, but he reveals who we are to ourselves. So it would follow that a relationship with Jesus unlocks these other dimensions of conversion more readily, I think. Okay? I think there's great value in these things. And I think in the context of youth ministry, for example, when we help young people engage in these things, if they never come to a place of conversion to Christ, like for me, I would absolutely want that. A youth ministry that's not wanting that and trying to work towards that. I'm not sure. It might be other things. It's probably not youth ministry as far as I understand it, okay? Catholic youth ministry or Christian youth ministry. However, if someone, like we can't make faith happen for somebody else, right? We can only provide a context by which they are able to encounter the person of Christ. We increase the possibility of that when we encourage young people to do this. But if young people also never come to a place of conversion, but they have opened up in these different ways, they've got a deeper appreciation for beauty, there's been a healing of negative affect in their lives. Like sometimes the obvious example of that would be, you know, someone receives therapy for a childhood trauma or something like that. But you know, there are lots of people, those of you in youth ministry will know this, lots of young people who the experience of being in a group of other young people where they're accepted, cared for, loved is deeply healing. Yeah? It can shape them and form them and restore something of them in a really powerful way. That's a beautiful gift to provide to a young person. It's a graced gift. Even if they walk away and say, well, I don't believe in Jesus, but gee, thanks very much for the way you guys loved me. Okay? That's, you know, for us, we should celebrate that as a beautiful, good thing that we're doing in someone's life. Helping for people to develop a critical faculty in their life. Okay? Getting people to think and actually engage and ask questions. Okay? A kind of ministry that doesn't encourage that is a problem. If you remember, we go back to Taylor for a moment. Because we live in a world where the possibility of not believing is always in front of me, it's not like the whole world or our whole culture is filled with people of faith. The possibility of not believing is always there before me. If we say your doubts are wrong, you can't ask questions, don't explore anything, that's a really big problem, because that's what you're actually saying is the questions that you already have, the doubts that are already surfacing are impermissible. We're not helping people and young people. We're not helping young people in particular. If we can provide a place where people can explore those questions, where they can wrestle with them, where they can engage with them critically and not reactively. You know, sometimes people don't actually really think through those questions. They just default position is, I don't agree with this, or I'm against that. If we can help a young person or a not so young person to engage really critically in something and say, yeah, okay, let's really think about this. Let's really explore that issue, rather than just either you can't think that or here's what you should think, but rather let's actually explore why you might think this or why you might think something else. Again, a young person might walk away saying, I don't agree with you, but if we've helped them to form a critical faculty, we've done a profound service. Okay, we've done something really beautiful. We could keep playing those out, both in a new moral horizon and a commitment to justice. Young person who has had a great experience of serving with the youth group at a soup van, for example, okay? They come to their time and they say, well, you know, I never believed in the Jesus that those guys talked about, but gee, they gave me a heart for those who are suffering, okay? We might want more for them than that, because we believe in the value of a relationship with God, of the love that God has for them. We would want that for them. But if they walk away and they say, well, that's not been my experience, but I did come away with this, then again, we've provided a service to them. We've helped them. And the possibility of something down the track, the possibility of God's self-revelation to them down the track, I think has increased. I think it's more likely than less. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, how we said turn off your phones. Okay. All right, just in the last couple of minutes, implications for ministry around initial conversion. Well, Rambo's material that we were just looking at would say that things that we want to make sure that we're offering for young people, and not just for young people, is we want to provide a context where they meet credible witnesses, that encounter piece, right? And we want to provide a context where if they're searching, we can actually help them on their search. Yeah. So Rambo's piece here would say we can't make someone have an initial conversion. That's something God does, right? What we can create are the conditions of possibility for that. The metaphor I like to use is we can lay the fire, but only God can ignite it, right? So you can lay the wood, but only God will provide the ignition point, the match. Yeah. So what's the wood? Well, I think our reflections today would be things like the encounter with people who are alive in their faith, who are joyful witnesses of hope and love. People who are able to engage with people with their questions, their searching, even their wrestling. You know, I don't believe anything that you guys are on about, and I don't believe a bar of it. Being able to hold that, as it were, and to be able to let people ask those questions and explore further and so forth. Those are the kinds of things. There's more that could be said, but I think they're the kinds of things that we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about initial conversion. And we'll pick that up more in the last lecture in this series. We also want to be thinking about how do we bring that initial experience, someone has a taste of God's love. You know, so for example, last weekend at St. Declan's we had our Alpha Retreat Day, and so people were prayed with, and lots of people are telling us that they experienced something profound. You know, sometimes they struggle to put language to it. They can't quite name what they've experienced, but they know that they felt something, which we would say was, the presence and action of God at work in their life. For that initial encounter, that initial taste of the love of God to mature to the point where someone says, I'm a committed follower of Christ. I'm a person of prayer. I love the scriptures. The sacraments are important to me. I'm trying to live a life that really cares and reaches out to others. I really believe in the value and importance of Christian community. I'm really trying to make sure that I've got a particular care for those who are suffering and hurting, all because that's what this new relationship I have with Jesus calls me to. If we're going to get people from there to there, then that's that bringing initial conversion to maturity. The RCIA would say that the things that are crucial there are the things that Rambo's picked up on. The things of, we want to make sure that there's a real network of relationships, of support and care for a person. We want to make sure that they learn by doing, they get involved in the mission and practice of the church, whether that's at the level of service to the poor, or whether it's them helping learning already how to share their faith with others. We also want to make sure that they have an experience of really learning how to pray and deepen and growing in prayer so that their relationship with God's nurtured. And yes, we also want them to learn some stuff. We want them to experience an intellectual dimension of our faith, to understand that there's a rich intellectual tradition, and to understand that and be formed and shaped in that, to give them a chance to pose questions and to learn and all that sort of thing too. That's the ingredients, I think, of bringing an initial conversion to maturity. Again, the fourth lecture in this series, we're going to try and put the things of the previous three together to try and sort of give us a little bit of a model. Finally, I just thought this is a concept worth just briefly naming, and we don't have much time to talk about it at great depth, but I just wanted to name it. And that is that we want people to be responsibly converted. Now, what do I mean by that? It's a little bit to do with that, both that conversion religiously that could sometimes happen without an intellectual dimension or without an affective dimension. And so what I'm saying there is that sometimes, a young person for a bunch of reasons may have an experience of conversion and not have experienced those things. That's not their fault, okay? So there might be a certain kind of rigidity to their faith, which is actually kind of a brittleness often if you feel about it. It's like, don't push too hard on this because I'm a bit scared it's going to break. It's new, it's precious to me. Don't challenge it too much because I'm worried that it's going to fall over if you push too hard, yeah? We have a responsibility, I think, to help people to say that conversion involves a surrender of my life to God, that God's in charge of my life, that I want God to lead and guide and direct my life. And there's an irresponsible way of doing that if I then actually abdicate all responsibility for my life, right? And so an example might be that I say, okay, well, there's a powerful, the priest or the pastor or my youth minister or somebody in my life, I'm no longer going to actually take responsibility for my life, but whatever they say goes, right? There's something deeply irresponsible about that. And a minister that lets that happen is being deeply irresponsible, yeah? Because a young person or a not so young person, they have to be able to make decisions for their life. Yes, they need to be surrendered to God, but it's irresponsible for us to stand in the place of God in such a way that they actually think that we're the voice of God. Yeah? What we do want to encourage, part of that responsible conversion, I think, is that they do recognise the role and place of the scriptures in their life and the role and place of the teaching of the church in their life. That these are the ways in which God's voice is mediated to us. That does not mean an uncritical engagement with either of those things. So the Bible says that it must be true is a statement that needs a lot more kind of interrogation and wrestling with, okay? And that'd be something that we'd want to try and explore in the course next year. But at the same time, we do want to be able to say, you know what, when Jesus says that, for example, that my finances, that I've got to think about where my money goes and where I spend it and what I spend it on, that's actually part of being a follower of his, and that's deeply embedded in the scriptures, then I need to actually take that really seriously because it's Jesus speaking through the scriptural witness. When the church teaches on a particular moral question, it doesn't mean that I simply just say, okay, well, if the church says it must be so, I've got a responsibility to engage with that. But if I believe that, as we do as Catholics, that God's teaching is mediated through the church, then I think I've got at the very least a presumption that the church has some wisdom to offer here, that I'm going to be guided by the church's teaching. I've got a responsibility to understand it. I've got a responsibility to explore it. I've got a responsibility to try and make sense of it. But I'm also going to come from a position actually of around the church, and we've got to make some distinctions around the church's teaching. What I get up and say on Sunday morning may or may not be the church's teaching, okay? I hope it is, but it may or may not be. But when the church teaches and it does that in and through things like councils and in magisterial statements, then I have a responsibility to engage with those and say, this is the church trying to teach me, not to tell me what to do in a kind of authoritarian kind of way, but in a way that says this is the way that we understand God is shaping us and what God intends for us as a church and as a human family. There's a whole lot of challenge and nuance in that, isn't there? Okay, it's a difficult thing, but it's a really important thing. Because if I come through the end of this process and I still think that I'm the one ultimately in charge of my life, then my conversion is lacking something substantial because Jesus is supposed to be in charge. And that can't be just an airy-fairy kind of way. The way Jesus is in charge of my life is mediated through the means that he's given us, which is his church, and in a particular way, the scriptures that have been formed in and through the church. Okay, that's a bigger topic than we can really, I hope that's been provocative enough to get you thinking, but it's bigger than we can kind of possibly exhaust in this moment. And hopefully it's a little taster about why you might like to do the course next year too. Okay. So, I went on for about a good 5 minutes longer than I'd hoped to. Can we take just a couple of minutes of questions and then I think we'll wrap up. No, beauty. Fantastic.
Sorry.
We'll come back to you, Darren.
Yes, Father, as you said, responsible conversion. It's really something really deep. You're trying to say that we can't take anything for granted. We've got to study the scripture, reason out for ourselves, walk with God, and really grow. I think in the last talk we heard about from Sherry Bordel, she's saying we're cradle Catholics, then you have this other phase where you're like a teenager and then adult responsible. So that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. It is, and we, part of, the analogy of the life cycle of a person's helpful. When somebody newly commits to Christ, they are like a little baby, like we are like little babies, and we've got to grow, and you've got to grow up. You never cease to be a son or daughter of God, but you can be an adult son or daughter of God rather than a infant or a teenage son or daughter of God, yeah? And that isn't necessarily about chronological age. I can be 44 and an infant in Christ, yeah? So, yeah, thank you.
I suppose I'm just thinking around the conversion as part of the journey of the already cradle Catholic baptised, and especially in older generations, I suppose, and that affective conversion seems to be the most difficult. And because, and I suppose what I'm sorry, this is going to be more on a comment. I hate trying to make comments, but there's a sense in which, in my experience, people have often said, I don't relate to God that way. I don't need to relate to God that way. I don't, and especially when they're talking about the more spiritual, that Jesus is revealing himself to me, that I'm experiencing Jesus' love personally, which seems to be on the affective level. I guess what I'm asking perhaps is just some thoughts around that, because certainly that seems to be, for a lot of the older generation, well, we were just told that you need to go to Mass every Sunday, that we need to pray, and that's it. As long as we follow the rules of the church, then that's fine, that's done. But what we're saying here in conversion is that effective conversion is actually really important. But it also seems to be the hardest to either experience that this is actually God, rather than just, I can appreciate standing on a beautiful mountaintop and appreciating beauty or whatever. Do you get what I mean? I may not be clear.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking. I think you're saying something important. One thought that I'd have there is that and this is where the different the conversion has its different dynamics, right? And so that I'm thinking about the interaction here of the intellectual conversion. So there's that intellectual conversion that happens at a very cognitive level where I'm learning things. There's that more intuitive kind of dimension which maybe kind of connects and blends in with the affective. At least Gelpie would talk about it like that. And what that might involve is a shift of my image of God. So that my image of God is, so there's something intuitive about that. It's at a felt kind of level. And you're trying to, connect at that level. Where I think things from our tradition can be really helpful there is because we're talking about change at the level of affect and change at the level of that intuitive kind of dimension, throwing more ideas isn't going to solve it. And I think part of our practice has been often that's what we think will work, is if we give them a new idea, that will change it. But what I think actually is going on is like an idea is a step removed from that intuitive, affective dimension. And so what we want to try and be offering there, I think, are a couple of things. One is that ritual and story actually meet us in a different kind of place. Okay, so ritual action is always symbolic action. Symbols actually speak to us at a different level than the purely cognitive. And so this is why we can draw, and this is how we can draw upon some of the rich symbols of faith, I think. So, whether it's, for example, in youth ministry, the youth mission team, the candle ceremony, where you invite people to come up and make a commitment and they light a candle as a sign of that commitment or that desire, that can be quite a powerful experience for a young person because it's meeting them at that level, yeah? I'm not quite sure why we would think that we shouldn't be doing that with people who are no longer young. So that's one part. The story part's another part of that. I think is that we both the story of people of faith, so testimony, but then also the actual story of the gospel. So rather than presenting the gospel as a set of doctrines to be believed or ideas to be assented to, we're saying here's the story, or if you like, the drama of what God has done for us in Jesus and through the Spirit. Because we're story-making people, we're addicted to stories. What we're inviting people, when we tell that as a story, the drama of salvation, if you like, we're inviting people to find themselves within that story. So when we start to say, here, the foundational story of Christian faith is that God created us out of love, that he wants us to live a life of love, that we have in some way or another turned away from that. And so Jesus comes and dies for us in order that we might be restored to relationship with God and with each other. You can find yourself in that story, and it's through the Spirit that you find yourself in that story. And faith is saying yes to that. I think that has the potential to move it, particularly for an older, because I think older generations of Catholics, it was really heady. It was really cerebral. And so things that kind of break out of that and getting down at that other level, ritual and story are crucial in that. Yeah. Okay. Great. Can I finish with, I'm just going to really quickly walk you through, this will come out in the next couple of weeks on the Arete website in our prospectus, but just the course in 5 steps, so you understand the course in five moments, okay? So moment 1 is that we have, or the 5 units really. So the first unit is this. It's first of all grounded in the encounter kind of that we've been talking about, okay? So it's in a retreat kind of context. The Disciples of Jesus community run a summer school each year, and the first part of the Arete course will be to share in that summer school experience in January. The second part of that first unit is a retreat, which is about deepening and growing in prayer, okay? So that's option 1. Not option 1, module 1, unit 1. Unit 2 is semester 1, Wednesday nights, and that's the theological foundations of mission, okay? So we're going to unpack key principles of mission from the church's tradition. We're going to propose a model of that in the light of the context we live in. So some of the stuff that you've heard here, but going into a lot more depth and looking at things like scripture from the perspective of mission, as well as the church's teaching on evangelization and so on. That's semester 1. Semester 2 is about leadership, the practice and theory of leadership for mission. Okay, so that's the Wednesday nights in semester 2. That's 1, 2, 3 units. The 4th unit are 2 intensives which focus on, they're streamed, and the 3 streams are youth ministry, adult evangelization, and leading music in a faith community. So that 4th unit will be 2 intensives, and you'll be in one of those 3 streams, depending on which stream you want to do, what stream is most appropriate for you. Then the final unit of the course stretches from term 2 through to the end of the year, and that's a field placement where if you're already working in a ministry in the church, you're a family educator or you're a youth minister or you're involved in your parish council, then what you would do is that work that you're already doing, you might be the Alpha coordinator in your parish, that work that you're already doing, that becomes your field placement, okay? And we'll provide a sort of a mentoring kind of process to encourage you to reflect upon what you've been doing in the light of what you've been learning, and to try and bring those 2 things together, the theory and the practice together. If you don't have a ministry that readily will just try and place you somewhere where you can get that kind of experience. So all of that will come up on the website in the next little bit, and also the prospectus will be out very shortly this week, I think, or next week, soon, as well. So, but I just thought we'll give you a little thumbnail sketch now. There'll be much more detail in the next couple of weeks. Okay, thanks.